So I was at a wedding last week, and I enjoy weddings. There's so much celebration there. And you have romantic love, and you have everyone dressed up, and you have receptions, ceremonies, beauty. It's a very special occasion. But there's another reason that I enjoy weddings as well. I enjoy weddings because they take the greatness of God seriously. I mean, the couple are making vows, right? They're not just making promises to each other. They're making vows. They're invoking God's presence along with the witnesses that they are vowing to care for each other, to love each other, to stay with each other till death do us part. And before God, they are taking this serious vow on this solemn occasion. Now that's pretty cool. David takes God seriously as well. And we see that in Psalm 138 that we're going to look at today. So I'll start out with the first couple of verses of Psalm 138. David says this, "I will praise you, O Lord, with all my heart. Before the gods, I will sing your praise. I will bow down toward your holy temple. I will praise your name for your love and your faithfulness. For you have exalted above all things your name and your word." So what happens when we go beyond a tame God? What happens when we are jolted by God Himself and moved out of our comfort zone? Well, I think what we find is that we have the same response that David had here in Psalm 138. When we think magnificently of God and when we take Him serious, it brings us to praise. That's exactly what happened here in verse 1, where he starts out, "I will praise you, O Lord, with all of my heart." So it brings us to praise. And praises are saying words of His greatness. And it brings us to open-heartedness, a willingness to receive, to respond, to listen, to look God square in the face and say to God, "You are God." It's that open-heartedness. And it brings us to humility. He says, "I will bow down." When we bow our head, when we bow our knee, we are giving reverence and honor and humility to the person that we're bowing for. And ultimately, we're bowing to God. God is infinite. That means He has no limits. He's transcendent. He is above and beyond human experience. And He's sovereign. That means He's in absolute authority. So you have these big, overwhelming, grand, superlative things about God. But the psalmist also tells us that He's loving and that He's faithful. He wants the very best for us, and He keeps His promises. This is the God of the Bible. When Israel came out of Egypt and they were in the wilderness and He gave them the law, you remember the 10 Commandments. You may have memorized the 10 Commandments. At least you know some of them. The first one says this, "You shall have no other gods before me." And the second, "You shall not make for yourself an idol in any form. You shall not bow down to them to worship them." And that's what David's saying here. Before the gods, I will sing your praise. Now, there's an abundance of gods throughout the world, and they're known to us. We have Brahma and Vishnu of Hinduism. We have Odin of the Vikings, Ra of the Egyptians, Baal of the Canaanites, Shiva of yoga. We have Allah of the Muslims, and the Buddhists have Bishama, which is actually brought over into anime, and you may see that god there in anime. The pantheists worship nature, and the pagans worship Anya. There's a slew of other gods who are not really gods. But you know, there can really only be one ultimate God. Because by definition, God is the greatest. He is supreme. He is the greatest necessary being. And all other gods are not gods. So what Christians have learned throughout history is that the one true God who revealed himself in biblical scriptures is the most consistent, the most complete, the most humane, and by far the most hopeful of all the other options. He's personal. He gets involved. He steps into our world. He gives us himself on the cross. He gives us a complete understanding of God himself, of the world, and of life. And we could look at that in a much deeper way. But it is just, of all the other options, it is just the very best option that's out there. And now, we learn something even greater, more amazing, that God, the Lord God Almighty, actually notices us. And it's not in a, you better watch out, I'm going to get you, I'm watching you. You know, it's not in that kind of way. It's completely different. Listen to the end of 138, verse 6 through 8. Though the Lord is on high, he looks upon the lowly. But the proud he knows from afar. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve my life. You stretch out your hand against the anger of my foes. With your right hand you save me. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your love, O Lord, endures forever. Do not abandon the works of your hands. There is a Hebrew word for God. It's called El Shaddai. It means the Lord God Almighty. And El Shaddai, the Lord God Almighty, notices what's going on in our life, as he talks about here in 138, verse 6 through 8. And that's just quite amazing. You know, when you look up at the stars and the moon and the sky, you just have to ask yourself, what is mankind that you're mindful of them? What are human beings that you care for them? But he does. In all of his greatness, in his wonder, and our praise to him, he notices and takes note of what's going on in our life. And verse 6 specifically notes that he notices when we're in our low moments. He notices the lowly. When we're in our low moments, we tend to be the most humble and the most open-hearted. We tend to be the most reliant upon God. When things are difficult, when we're hurting, when crisis comes into our life, when we get a new struggle, there's a new temptation comes, when there's difficulties, those tend to be the times when we are most open to God and most humble toward him. And he takes note of that. He notices your plight. He knows that your heart is wounded. He knows that your children are struggling, and you are as well. He knows about those voices in your head that are unrelenting and living with anxiety and loneliness. He knows about those bad decisions that have complicated your life, that you just can't seem to get ahead. He knows about the abuse in your life. He knows your brokenheartedness. God takes note of the lowly. He takes note of those that are humble and are reliant upon Him. The proud, not so much. Self-reliance, God-defiance, no, not so much. But when we are open to Him and when we are not proud, He is very aware of what's going on in our lives. And that's really a key spiritual insight for today. The Lord God Almighty watches over those who are reliant upon Him. Be reliant in these times of difficulty, in these times of trouble. We already looked at the greatness and supremeness of God. He is magnificent, and He watches over those who are lowly and humble. When we are reliant upon God, He gives us Himself. He gave us Himself when He gave Jesus to come to live the perfect life, to be obedient to death on the cross, to rise from the dead, and to ascend on high where He is our advocate. He gave Himself. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from Himself because it's not there. There's no such thing. When God gives us Himself, He's giving us all that there is. He's giving us joy and happiness and answers and peace. He's giving us the ability to call upon Him. And that's another thing that the psalmist talks about here in 138. He infuses our soul with strength when we call upon Him. He talks about that in verse 3. Now, He doesn't shield us from all trouble, but He does undergird us, and He does keep us. He does fulfill His purposes in our life, as He talks about in verse 8. God is true. He is the true God. He is the faithful God, the loving God. And because He's faithful, He is a promise keeper. He keeps His word. He is doing what He says that He will do. What is our response to that? How do we respond to this God? We respond the same way that David talked about responding in 138. Verse 5 says, "May they, the kings, sing of the ways of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord is great." He calls upon the kings. He calls upon the leaders of the world to sing praises to God. And that is our response as we know the greatness of God when He's watching over us and we are relying upon Him.